Welcome back to the program. Glad to get your phone calls and emails at 866-HEY-LARS. Naysayers go to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. Emails go to talk@larslarson.com. And I'm going to turn to Joel Griffith, who's currently a research fellow at the Institute for Economic Freedom and Opportunity at Heritage, about whether or not this new infrastructure plan, $3 to $4 trillion that Joe Biden's going to outline tomorrow, and create a bunch of taxes to go with it, whether or not this thing is really about infrastructure, or is it more about changing the nature of America to a socialist society. Joel, welcome back to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me on tonight.
So do you see some value to this thing? Because every time I hear the government talk about, well, we're going to have shovel-ready jobs and we're going to go out and fix all the bridges and roads, the pushback I hear, and I think it's reasonable, is, well, most of our system is in pretty good shape. There are things that could use some improvement, but usually they end up spending all the money and saying, yeah, a tiny fraction of it actually ended up being spent on actual infrastructure, and the rest of it was just political handouts of one kind or another.
Yep, absolutely. And this one is more of the same, except it's just much, much bigger than in the past. We're looking at, with this infrastructure plan, close to $3 trillion on the so-called infrastructure component. But already, the numbers that are coming out, we know that only a small fraction of this proposed spending will actually go to typical infrastructure projects like freeways or airports. The bulk of this funds other projects such as wind turbines, a backdoor Green New Deal, a whole wish list of progressive government policies such as free college and expanding the welfare state in a manner that we haven't seen expanded since the Great Society, which was during LBJ. We don't have this $3 trillion. This is $3 trillion that we're going to have to borrow, that we're going to have to print, that we'll then go ahead and spend, and it's not even going to be on the typical items that we think of when it comes to infrastructure. This is just a bald-headed attempt to expand Big Brother and to centralize power in Washington, D.C.
Well, in fact, can we take a couple of those piece by piece? I don't know how far in the weeds you want to get, but you mentioned airports. And people, I know that the reaction people have to that is, well, yeah, airports, we should have nice airports. I think, look, I've flown in and out a bunch of America's airports. Most of them look like they're in pretty good shape. And I always had the impression that most of the physical improvements at airports were actually paid for with the ticket taxes of the people who travel, which I thought was perfectly appropriate. If you fly a lot, you're paying a lot of the money in. And if you don't fly a lot, then you have a nice looking airport that's paid for by the people who actually fly. Do we really need to dump either hundreds of billions of dollars into things like airports when they're already well funded by a mechanism that seems like the perfect way to pay for them?
No, you're so right. When we hear the word infrastructure, here's part of the problem is we think of things like the airport that we see when we visit friends and family, or we think of the freeways that we travel on to get to and from work. But that's not what this infrastructure bill is all about. Think about infrastructure costs, for instance, for airports. Roughly, airport costs are around $22 billion per year. That's not what this bill is for. This is a $3 trillion package, and it uses these words like infrastructure because politicians know when we think of infrastructure, we think of things like airports, things that are useful. We're not thinking of revolution transforming our energy system to unreliable energy sources, which is part of what this funding goes to. We don't think of handouts to cronyist companies that have that have connections in Washington, D.C. We don't think of free college for all. That's not what we think of, but they use these words. And George Orwell talked about this in the books that he wrote about the use of words that we're in common agreement on to actually push through agenda items that most of us would actually oppose. And that's what this is. It uses these great-sounding terms like infrastructure, puts us on the hook, though, for transferring so much control to Washington, D.C. And I think we should, it's important to look at, too, a lot of what we rely upon as people in our communities, our school buildings, our police stations, our libraries, these are funded by our local tax dollars.
Yep.
Good, because we're able to put pressure on our politicians, we're able to hold them accountable, we're able to make these projects transparent because we pay for it in our sales taxes and in our property taxes. When you go ahead and federalize this spending, which is what it does is it means that taxpayers in places like Tennessee and Kansas are now forced to pay for the mistakes of politicians in places like New York City. And you look at some of this spending, a lot of the spending actually goes to these transit programs in places like New York that have been crumbling, that have been failing for years, not because they're not spending money in those areas, but because they're squandering money. A typical mass transit worker in New York City makes upwards of $150,000 per year. And what this package does is it really federalizes those costs, meaning if you live in a well-managed state like Texas or Georgia, you are now going to be forced to pay for the foolishness that these politicians in places like Chicago and New York City are engaged in.
Well, I mean, for example, I could think of a lot of examples of that kind of thing. But this is where it gets really crazy. For instance, you mentioned energy. Let me ask you about that, because I've always liked the idea that the 50 states were 50 little laboratories of democracy. So if the utility companies in California want to spend a ton of money on solar and wind and charge the rates to their ratepayers that they actually cost, where other states say, no, you know what, we're going to go with more traditional energy that's more reliable and less expensive, then what happens is one state has sky-high electric bills, and companies that have to buy electricity to run their plant or run their operations say, now, we'd move to California. It's a nice climate, but boy, 40 cents a kilowatt hour, we're not going to do that. It's just too expensive. And it has the result that the local decisions made about how you want energy generated. We want to have solar and windmill. Great. You want us to pay 75 cents a kilowatt hour? Great. See how many people can afford to live in that or run a business in that. I think that's the way it should be done, instead of being driven, as you said, from Washington, D.C.
Yeah, and that's something we should all keep in mind. Places like California, electricity costs, if you're heating, cooling your home, are oftentimes double what the costs are elsewhere. If you have a business and you need to run your equipment, industrial electricity costs can be up to triple in California versus elsewhere. When you go ahead and you start channeling hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure spending into revolutionizing the electricity grid, forcing the grid to run on unreliable, pricey forms of energy, what you actually do is you hide that true cost. Because you're right, if you're in a place like California, you notice on your electricity bill how much these horrible policies are costing you, because you see, wow, I'm paying $200 a month to cool off my home, and this is only costing somebody in Houston half as much. You see that. When you go ahead and you channel this money to these cronyist energy interests, the wind turbine companies and the solar panel companies, when you do that, you might not actually have an electricity bill. Your bill might not actually be higher than elsewhere. But
Absolutely right. That's Joel Griffith, who's a research fellow at the Institute for Economic Freedom and Opportunity at Heritage. Glad to have you with me on a Tuesday night. 866-439-5277. You've got the Lars Larson Show.